55 feet below the burning streets of Berlin, surrounded by 16 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, the architect of the most destructive conflict in human history sat in a damp, claustrophobic room, listening to the relentless drumming of Soviet artillery. It was April 30th, 1945. The official narrative tells us that as the Red Army closed to within a few blocks of the Reich Chancellery, a single gunshot rang out, ending a regime that was supposed to last 1,000 years. But the official narrative was written by the victors, specifically by Soviet intelligence agencies whose primary weapon was deception. For decades, the true circumstances surrounding the final hours in the Führerbunker were locked away in classified Soviet archives, buried under layers of Cold War propaganda, geopolitical maneuvering, and deliberate disinformation. Did the command structure of the Third Reich simply evaporate in a suicide pact, or was there a more complex tactical and intelligence reality at play in those final, desperate hours? Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the myths of history and analyze the raw, unfiltered truth of military strategy, logistics, and combat operations. If you want to understand the mechanics of war without the Hollywood filter, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not deal in rumors here. We deal in ballistics, unit deployments, and the cold, hard math of the battlefield. To understand the mystery of those classified files, we first have to understand the catastrophic strategic collapse that forced an entire empire to shrink down to a few subterranean rooms. How does a military machine that conquered Europe in a matter of months end up trapped in a concrete box, waiting for the end? The answer is not just a matter of lost battles, but a fundamental failure in industrial capacity, logistical sustainability, and strategic vision. The German war machine was built for the Blitzkrieg, a war of rapid maneuver, deep penetration, and short operational timelines. It was a military doctrine perfectly suited for a nation with limited natural resources, designed to knock enemies out of the fight before a war of attrition could begin. But when Operation Barbarossa failed to destroy the Soviet Union in 1941, the Third Reich was drilled into the exact type of war it was mathematically guaranteed to lose. By the time we reached the spring of 1945, the German military was not just beaten, it was systematically dismantled. You cannot fight a mechanized war without fuel, and the Allied strategic bombing campaign had made sure the German military was running on fumes. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, had systematically pulverized German synthetic oil plants like Luna and Politz. The transportation network was shattered. Rail yards were craters. We talk a lot about the superiority of German armor, like the Tiger and the Panther, but what good is a 70-ton combat vehicle with a lethal 88mm gun if you do not have enough aviation fuel or diesel to move it out of the staging area? They became nothing more than heavily armored pillboxes, static targets for Allied ground attack aircraft and Soviet heavy artillery. We have seen this exact type of strategic strangulation before in American history. Look at the final days of the American Civil War in 1865, when General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were pinned down in the trenches of Petersburg, defending the Confederate capital of Richmond. The Union Army did not just beat Lee with frontal assaults. General Ulysses S. Grant cut the rail lines, destroyed the logistical hubs, and starved the Confederate Army of food, ammunition, and manpower. When the supply lines die, the army dies and the capital falls. Berlin in 1945 was Richmond in 1865, but on a scale of destruction that is almost incomprehensible. Or consider the Pacific Theater, specifically the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which were happening at the exact same time as the fall of Berlin. The Imperial Japanese Army, realizing could not win a conventional war of maneuver against American firepower, went underground. They built massive, interconnected bunker complexes, fighting a purely defensive war of attrition designed to inflict maximum casualties in a doomed effort to break the political will of the enemy. The German High Command adopted the exact same fatalistic strategy. The Führerbunker was the ultimate manifestation of this subterranean defense, a command post completely disconnected from the reality of the battlefield above. Let us look at the raw numbers, because the correlation of forces in April 1945 dictates the inevitability of what happened in that bunker. The Soviet war machine that converged on Berlin was a logistical and tactical juggernaut unlike anything the world had ever seen. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, and Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, brought a combined force of 2.5 million men to the gates of the German capital. This was not the disorganized, poorly equipped Red Army of 1941. This was a highly mechanized, combat-hardened force executing the doctrine of deep battle. They brought with them 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns. The backbone of this armored fist was the T-34-85, a medium tank that perfectly balanced mobility, armor, and firepower. But for the urban meat grinder of Berlin, the Soviets relied heavily on the IS-2 heavy tank. Weighing in at over 100,000 pounds with frontal armor up to 4.7 inches thick, the IS-2 was designed to absorb punishment. More importantly, it mounted a massive 122mm main gun. This weapon fired a 55-pound high-explosive shell that could literally blow a German defensive position or a reinforced concrete building to dust. But the true god of war for the Red Army was its artillery. The Soviets massed 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars for the Berlin offensive. To put that into perspective, that is an average of nearly 300 guns for every single mile of the front line. The logistical footprint required to feed that much artillery is staggering. We are talking about millions of artillery shells, millions of gallons of fuel, and tens of thousands of tons of rations, all moved across a shattered Eastern European infrastructure by a massive fleet of American-supplied Studebaker trucks and rebuilt rail lines. When the Soviet bombardment began at the Silo Heights, the preliminary barrage was so intense that the shockwaves could be felt in the center of Berlin, over 40 miles away. How do you defend a city against a force that can literally level city blocks with indirect fire before their infantry even crosses the street? You do not defend it, you just delay the inevitable. Facing this Soviet behemoth was a phantom army. Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, was tasked with defending the approaches to Berlin. Heinrici was arguably the greatest defensive tactician in the German army, a master of trading space for time and pulling his troops out of the main line of resistance right before a Soviet artillery barrage hit. But even a tactical genius cannot perform miracles without troops or ammunition. On paper, the Germans had roughly 766,000 men. In reality, this force was a patchwork of shattered regular army units, Waffen-SS remnants, and the Volkssturm, a national militia made up of old men and young boys. Divisions existed in name only, often possessing the combat strength of a single understrength battalion. They had roughly 1,500 tanks, but as discussed, the fuel shortage made them practically immobile. The defense of Berlin relied heavily on the Panzerfaust, a cheap, single-shot, disposable anti-tank weapon firing a shaped charge warhead. In the hands of a terrified Hitler Youth or a World War I veteran, a Panzerfaust hidden in the rubble of a ruined building could absolutely destroy a Soviet T-34. But it was a suicide mission. The tactical doctrine of the Volkssturm was essentially to hide in the debris, wait for the Soviet armor to pass, fire a rocket at the rear armor, and hope you did not get vaporized by the accompanying Soviet infantry. The physical environment of Berlin itself dictated the brutal nature of the close-quarters combat. This was an urban warfare nightmare. The city was already heavily damaged by years of British and American strategic bombing. Rubble actually favors the defender, turning every collapsed apartment building into a fortified fighting position. The Germans had also constructed massive flak towers, enormous above-ground concrete fortresses armed with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. The Zoo Tower, for example, was a monolithic structure with concrete walls up to 11 feet thick, armed with twin 128mm flak guns. These guns, originally designed to shoot down American heavy bombers, were depressed to fire horizontally into the advancing Soviet armor. The high-velocity 128mm armor-piercing shells could punch through multiple Soviet tanks in a single shot. These towers were virtually impervious to Soviet field artillery, serving as massive strongpoints that forced the Red Army to bleed for every inch of ground. But strongpoints without mobile reserves are just traps. The Soviets simply bypassed the heaviest resistance, isolated the strong points, and continued their relentless push toward the government district in the center of the city. As the perimeter collapsed, the command and control structure inside the Führerbunker deteriorated into absolute delusion. The bunker complex was located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery. It was built in two phases, with the lower level, the actual Führerbunker, completed in 1944. It was a self-contained survival capsule, equipped with its own diesel generator, air filtration system, and a telephone exchange. But, as the Soviet artillery severed the communication cables, the high command of the Third Reich was reduced to getting their tactical updates by listening to public radio broadcasts. The leader of the German war machine was issuing orders to phantom armies. He ordered SS General Felix Steiner to launch a massive counterattack to relieve the city. Steiner's detachment was a disorganized rabble with no heavy weapons and no offensive capability whatsoever. The counterattack never happened, because the units ordered to execute it simply did not exist as combat-effective formations. This disconnect from reality is crucial to understanding the final hours. The psychological collapse of the leadership mirrored the physical collapse of the defensive perimeter. But why did the events of April 30th become such a convoluted mystery? If the outcome was so inevitable, why are there classified files, contradictory witness statements, and decades of conspiracy theories? The answer lies in the vanguard of the Soviet advance. The units that first breached the Chancellery area were accompanied by operatives of SMERSH, the Soviet Military Counterintelligence Agency, and the NKVD, the secret police. Their mission was not just to capture the city, but to capture the physical evidence of the regime's destruction. Stalin was a master of political manipulation. He understood that whoever controlled the narrative of Hitler's death controlled the psychological closure of the war in Europe. The forensic reality of what happened in that bunker was immediately classified, heavily compartmentalized, and manipulated to serve Soviet geopolitical interests. Stalin deliberately lied to American and British leaders, including President Harry Truman, hinting that the German leader might have escaped to Argentina or Spain. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated intelligence operation designed to sow distrust among the Western allies and justify a massive continued Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe to hunt down supposed Nazi remnants. The mystery is not a product of poor record-keeping. It is the result of a deliberate state-sponsored disinformation campaign. The Soviets possessed the dental records, the fragments of the skull, the blood-soaked sofa, and the eyewitness testimonies of the surviving bunker staff. Yet they locked this data in the archives of the Lubyanka in Moscow. They allowed the rumors of escape to flourish because a living phantom was more politically useful to the Soviet Union than a dead dictator. To unravel this intelligence operation, we have to look past the political theater and examine the forensic and tactical evidence that was suppressed for half a century. We have to analyze the chemical properties of the cyanide capsules, the ballistic trajectory of a 7.65mm Walther PPK pistol, and the logistical impossibility of an escape through a city entirely surrounded by 2.5 million hostile troops. But before we can conduct that forensic analysis of the final gunshot, we have to breach the perimeter of Berlin itself, street by bloody street, to understand the tactical nightmare that sealed the doors of that concrete tomb forever. To understand the sheer brutality of the fighting outside the Chancellery, you have to strip away the grand strategic arrows on the map and look at the terrifying reality of a three-dimensional urban kill zone. The Red Army had learned their lessons the hard way. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 8th Guards Army, was the same man who had defended Stalingrad in 1942. He knew that in a ruined city, armor is blind and artillery is a blunt instrument. The real currency of urban warfare is the infantry assault group. These were specialized shock units, usually consisting of 10 to 12 men, armed to the teeth for close quarters combat. Their primary weapon was the PP-41 submachine gun. Firing a 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge from a massive 71-round drum magazine, this weapon was an absolute buzzsaw in enclosed spaces. It had an astonishing rate of fire of 900 rounds per minute. It was not accurate at long range, but in the dust-choked hallways of a ruined Berlin apartment complex, You do not need accuracy. You need volume of fire. Do you walk through the front door of a building held by desperate men with machine guns? Absolutely not. The Soviets utilized a tactic known as mouse-holing. Instead of fighting up the stairs, which the Germans heavily booby-trapped and covered with interlocking fields of fire, Soviet combat engineers would pack explosives against the interior walls. They would blow a hole directly into the adjacent room, throw in a handful of F-1 fragmentation grenades, and sweep the room with submachine gun fire before the dust even settled. We saw the exact same brutal geometry of urban combat utilized by the United States Marine Corps during the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004. When Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, were clearing insurgent strongholds, they quickly realized that doorways were fatal funnels. They brought up Abrams tanks or used C4 explosives to breach the walls directly, bypassing the fatal funnels entirely. The physics of clearing a fortified room do not change, whether it is Iraq in 2004 or Germany in 1945. The only difference is the scale of the carnage. Defending against these Soviet assault groups, the German infantry relied heavily on the MG-42 general-purpose machine gun. This was arguably the most lethal infantry weapon of the Second World War. Firing a 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge at a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG-42 sounded like ripping canvas. But it had a fatal logistical flaw in a surrounded city. It consumed ammunition at a rate that a cut-off garrison simply could not sustain. A 250-round belt of ammunition would be gone in a matter of seconds. Furthermore, the extreme rate of fire melted the barrels. German machine gunners were trained to swap the red-hot barrel every 250 rounds, a process that took only seconds, but required a steady supply of spare barrels. By late April, the supply lines were non-existent. German gunners were firing their weapons until the barrels warped, turning the most feared machine gun in the world into a useless, jammed piece of scrap metal. The Germans also deployed limited numbers of the Sturmgewehr 44, history's first true assault rifle. Firing the intermediate 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz round, it gave the individual German soldier unprecedented firepower. But again, tactical brilliance cannot overcome logistical starvation. An assault rifle is just a club if you do not have the magazines to feed it. Let us look at the man tasked with orchestrating this doomed defense. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, was an artillery officer who had just been condemned to death by a firing squad days earlier because of a misunderstanding over a retreat. Now he was pardoned and ordered to hold a city that was already burning to the ground. Weidling set up his command post as a Bendler block, a massive military headquarters building complex just a mile from the Führerbunker. The contrast between Weidling's reality and the delusion in the bunker is staggering. Weidling had no communications to assist his units other than runners, young boys on bicycles trying to navigate streets completely cratered by 122 mm artillery shells. He knew his command was disintegrating. By April 28th, the Soviet concentric rings of steel were tightening. The objective was the government district, specifically the Reichstag and the Reichskanzlei. To get there, the Soviets had to cross the Spree River and the Landwehr Canal. Bridges in urban combat are choke points of absolute slaughter. The fight for the Moltke Bridge on April 28th and 29th is a perfect case study in the sheer cost of frontal assaults. The bridge was heavily barricaded and wired with explosives by the Germans. It was covered by 88 mm anti-aircraft guns firing in the direct ground roll and raked by crossfire from heavily fortified buildings on the opposite bank. How do you push an armored column across a 300-foot span of open concrete when the enemy has it zeroed in with high-velocity armor-piercing shells? You do it with sheer, overwhelming mass, and you accept the horrific casualties. Soviet tanks attempted to rush the bridge, only to be brewed up by Panzerfausts and 88s. The burning hulks of T-34 tanks actually provided cover for the Soviet infantry of the 150th Rifle Division to crawl forward under the cover of darkness and heavy artillery smoke. They fought hand-to-hand in the barricades, using sharpened entrenching tools and bayonets. This was not modern, over-the-horizon warfare. This was medieval butchery with automatic weapons. It is highly reminiscent of the Battle of Antietam in 1862, specifically the assault on Burnside's bridge. Union troops were funneled into a narrow stone bridge covered by Confederate sharpshooters on the high ground. The Union took massive casualties trying to force the crossing, just as the Soviets bled for the Moltke Bridge. Terrain dictates the tactics, and a bridge over a deep river leaves the attacker with zero options for maneuver. You either push through the kill zone or you stop the advance. The Soviets pushed. As the surface became a wasteland of shattered concrete and burning steel, the battle moved underground. The Berlin U-Bahn, the subway system, became a subterranean highway for both sides. German troops used the tunnels to move reserves behind Soviet lines, popping up out of subway grates to ambush Soviet supply convoys. In response, the Soviets began clearing the tunnels with flamethrowers and satchel charges. The environment down there was a literal hell. The temperature in those enclosed tunnels, heated by fires and explosions, reached well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with pulverized concrete dust, the acrid smoke of cordite, and the unmistakable sweet stench of decaying bodies. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. Then, in one of the most controversial events of the battle, the bulkheads holding back the Landwehr Canal were blown. Millions of gallons of freezing water flooded into the S-Bahn and U-Bahn tunnels. Thousands of wounded German soldiers, civilians sheltering from the artillery, and Soviet assault troops were drowned in the pitch-black, freezing water. The exact culprit remains debated, but the tactical result was clear. The subterranean maneuver routes were sealed. The fight was forced back to the meat grinder on the surface. On April 29th, the focal point of the Soviet fury shifted to the Reichstag. Strategically, the Reichstag building was meaningless. It had been an abandoned, burned-out shell since the mysterious fire of 1933. But politically, Stalin demanded it. It was the symbol of the German state, and he wanted the Soviet flag flying over it before May Day. The assault fell to the troops of the 79th Rifle Corps. The Reichstag was defended by roughly 5,000 men, a fanatical mixture of SS troops, naval infantry flown in at the last minute, and Hitler Youth. They had fortified the mass stone building, bricking up the windows and leaving only small firing slits from machine guns. The open square in front of the building, the Königsplatz, was a massive kill zone. It was crisscrossed by anti-tank ditches and flooded with water from severed mains. To cross that square, the Soviets brought up heavy artillery to fire directly at point-blank range. They used 152mm howitzers and even 203mm heavy siege guns, firing directly into the stone facade of the Reichstag. The concussion from these weapons firing in an urban environment would literally shatter the eardrums of anyone within a 50-yard radius. Captain Stepan Neustroev, commanding a battalion of the 150th Rifle Division, led the charge across the shattered square. The casualties were catastrophic, but the sheer weight of numbers forced a breach into the main hall. Once inside, the battle devolved into room-to-room, floor-to-floor combat that lasted for 2 days. It was pitch black inside the massive building, illuminated only by the muzzle flashes of weapons and the fires burning in the corridors. Men fought with grenades, submachine guns, and knives on the grand staircases. The Soviets would clear the first floor, only to have German troops drop grenades on them from the balconies above. It was a vertical nightmare. But while the world focuses on the symbolic fight for the Reichstag, the true center of gravity was just a few blocks south, at the Reich Chancellery. This was the massive, monolithic administrative headquarters designed by Albert Speer. And directly beneath its ruined gardens lay the Führerbunker. By the evening of April 29th, elements of the Soviet Third Shock Army and the 8th Guards Army had closed to within a quarter mile of the Chancellery. The German defensive perimeter had shrunk to a tiny island of rubble, roughly 1 mile long and a half-mile wide. The air was so thick with smoke and brick dust that the sun was completely blotted out, turning high noon into a dark, apocalyptic twilight. The Soviet artillery was now dropping shells directly onto the Chancellery gardens, churning the earth above the concrete roof of the bunker. The heavy thud of the 122mm shells could be felt vibrating through the 16-foot thick concrete ceiling. The physical battle for Berlin was effectively over, replaced by a mopping-up operation of unimaginable brutality. But as the Soviet assault groups stacked up outside the shattered bronze doors of the Chancellery, preparing to breach the final perimeter, a completely different type of operations was unfolding 55 feet below the surface. The tactical reality of the street fight was about to collide with the forensic mystery of the command bunker. What exactly happened when the steel doors were finally breached, and why did the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union immediately begin a systematic campaign to alter the physical evidence of the most important crime scene of the 20th century? The silence that followed the single gunshot at 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th was the sound of a catastrophic strategic failure reaching its absolute mathematical conclusion. Inside the study of the lower bunker, the scene was not one of Wagnerian operational glory, but of grim, claustrophobic desperation. The physical evidence left in that room has been the subject of intense, deliberate obfuscation, but when we apply rigorous forensic and ballistic analysis, the timeline of the most debated suicide in military history becomes coldly clear to us. The weapon of choice was a Walther PPK, chambered in 7.65 mm, also known as 32 ACP. This is a blowback-operated, semi-automatic pistol, highly reliable, but not particularly powerful by military standards. It fires a 73-grain projectile at roughly 900 feet per second. In a close-contact scenario, however, it is devastatingly lethal. The forensic reality, confirmed by the few eyewitnesses who entered the room and later verified by suppressed Soviet autopsy reports, indicates a simultaneous use of a thin glass ampoule containing hydrocyanic acid, commonly known as cyanide, and the Walther pistol. Cyanide induces cellular hypoxia, essentially starving the body's cells of oxygen and causing massive, rapid central nervous system collapse. The dual method was a paranoid insurance policy against a failure, a reflection of the absolute terror of being captured alive and paraded through Red Square in a steel cage. But the true logistical nightmare for the bunker survivors began immediately after the trigger was pulled. The standing orders were to completely destroy the remains, preventing the Soviets from capturing a trophy. How do you cremate two human bodies in a concrete trench while under a continuous devastating barrage of 122 mm Soviet artillery? It requires fuel, a commodity that, as we have established, the German war machine had completely exhausted. SS guards had to risk their lives dodging shrapnel in the Chancellery garage, desperately siphoning roughly 200 liters, or about 53 gallons, of aviation-grade petrol from the tanks of damaged staff cars. They carried this fuel in jerry cans back to the cratered garden. The bodies were placed in a shallow bomb crater, drenched in the petrol, and ignited with pieces of burning paper because the fierce downdrafts from the exploding Soviet shells kept blowing out their matches. The cremation was hasty, incomplete, and fundamentally flawed from a forensic destruction standpoint. Open-air burning with liquid accelerant does not generate the sustained 2,000-degree Fahrenheit temperatures required to completely incinerate human bone and dental work. And that incomplete destruction is exactly what gave Soviet intelligence the leverage to launch a massive geopolitical deception. When the assault troops of the Soviet Third Shock Army finally breached the bunker complex on May 2nd, they were immediately followed by operatives of SMERSH. SMERSH is an acronym for Smertspionam, meaning Death to Spies, the brutal counterintelligence department of the Red Army. Their primary objective was securing the physical remains of the German High Command. On May 5th, a SMERSH unit discovered the charred remains in the Chancellery garden. They secretly transported the bodies to a forensic clinic in the Berlin suburb of Buch. The Soviet autopsy, conducted by chief pathologist Dr. Faust Shkarovsky, definitively identified the remains. How did they do it? They did not have modern DNA profiling. They used the oldest and most reliable method of forensic identification in the theater of war, which is dental records. The dictator had highly distinct, extensive dental work, including a massive gold bridge held together by a solid gold bar. The Soviets tracked down Katha Heiserman, the dental assistant to Hugo Blaschke, the Führer's personal dentist. Under intense interrogation, she drew the exact dental charts from memory. When the Soviets compared her drawings to the charred jawbone they had recovered, it was a perfect, undeniable ballistic match. The forensic case was closed. The dictator was dead. So why did the mystery persist for decades? Why did millions of people believe the elaborate theories of escape via U-boat to a heavily fortified compound in the Andes Mountains of Argentina? Because Joseph Stalin mandated the mystery as a strategic weapon. We have to look at the intelligence and political landscape of May 1945. The alliance between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain was purely a marriage of convenience, and the divorce was already getting ugly. Stalin understood that information control is the ultimate form of geopolitical leverage. By classifying the autopsy reports and swearing the SMERSH operatives to absolute secrecy, Stalin created a phantom threat. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Stalin looked President Harry Truman directly in the eye and casually suggested that the German leader had escaped to Spain or South America. This was a calculated psychological operation. By keeping the myth of a surviving Nazi command structure alive, Stalin justified the continued aggressive mobilization of the Red Army and the brutal Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. He weaponized a conspiracy theory to keep the Western Allies off balance. We can see the profound danger of this type of intelligence manipulation when we compare it to how the United States military handled a very similar high-value target operation in 2011. During Operation Neptune Spear, when United States Navy SEALs raided the compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and eliminated Osama bin Laden, the tactical execution was only half the mission. The strategic objective was proving the kill beyond a shadow of a doubt while preventing the creation of a martyr's shrine. The United States military utilized immediate on-site biometric identification and subsequent DNA analysis to confirm the identity with absolute scientific certainty. Then they conducted a burial at sea from the deck of the USS Carl Vinson, completely erasing the physical footprint of the target. The American government controlled the narrative through transparency of the result, effectively suffocating any widespread conspiracy theories about bin Laden's survival. The Soviet Union in 1945 did the exact opposite. They hoarded the physical evidence in the archives of the Lubyanka and deliberately fed disinformation into the global intelligence stream. This deliberate obfuscation is incredibly similar to the chaotic aftermath of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. After Union cavalry cornered and killed John Wilkes Booth in a burning tobacco barn in Virginia, the federal government conducted a secret autopsy and buried Booth beneath the floorboards of the old penitentiary in Washington. The lack of public transparency, secrecy surrounding the burial, and the restriction of information immediately spawned decades of conspiracy theories claiming that Booth had escaped and that the government had killed a body double. Whenever a state apparatus hides the forensic reality of a high-profile death, it creates a vacuum, and human psychology will always fill that vacuum with elaborate survival myths. The Argentine U-boat escape theory is simply the 20th century version of the John Wilkes Booth survival myth. It ignores the cold, hard logistical realities of the battlefield. Let us analyze the sheer absurdity of an escape from a tactical and logistical perspective. By April 30th, Berlin was completely encircled by multiple Soviet armies. The airspace was totally dominated by the Red Air Force. There were no secret runways left. The famous test pilot Hanna Reich had barely managed to fly a Fieseler Storch light observation plane out of the city days earlier, using a shell-cratered avenue as a makeshift runway under heavy anti-aircraft fire. An escape by ground was even more impossible. The streets were choked with rubble, barricades, and millions of Soviet soldiers conducting systematic, house-to-house clearance operations. The idea that the most recognizable man on the planet, suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease and heavy narcotic withdrawal, could slip through the most concentrated ring of hostile military force in human history is an insult to the basic principles of military intelligence. Furthermore, the supposed destination for this escape, the heavily fortified Alpine Fortress or Alpenfestung in southern Germany and Austria, was another massive intelligence failure, but this time it was an American failure. In late 1944 and early 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, began receiving intelligence reports that the Germans were building a massive subterranean redoubt in the Alps stocked with years of ammunition, underground factories, and elite SS divisions prepare for a protracted guerrilla war. This intelligence was completely fabricated. It was a bluff orchestrated by German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels to deter the Allied advance. But the American High Command, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, took the bait. They diverted the advance of the U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton away from Berlin and the Elbe River, sending them south into Bavaria to cut off this phantom fortress. From an economic and logistical standpoint, the Alpine fortress was a mathematical impossibility. By early 1945, the German rail network was paralyzed. They could not even transport coal from the Ruhr Valley to their remaining steel mills, let alone move massive underground factories and millions of tons of supplies into the mountains. The German war economy had flatlined. You cannot build a fortress out of thin air when your industrial capacity is zero. The ultimate tactical lesson of the Führerbunker is the fatal vulnerability of a hyper-centralized psychophantic command structure. When a military apparatus is completely subordinated to the political will and psychological delusions of a single individual, it loses the ability to adapt to tactical reality. The German generals in the final months of the war were not allowed to execute mobile, elastic defense doctrines. They were ordered to hold static lines until they were annihilated by superior Soviet firepower. This is the exact same strategic paralysis we saw in the Iraqi military command during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein, isolated and surrounded by yes men, micromanaged the defense of Baghdad using outdated static defensive concepts against a highly mobile, technologically superior American mechanized force. Like the German leadership in 1945, the Iraqi leadership became completely disconnected from the battlefield, issuing orders to divisions that had already been destroyed from the air. And just like the architect of the Third Reich, Saddam Hussein was ultimately reduced to hiding in a subterranean dirt hole, stripped of all his grand military pageantry, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. Grand strategic blunders always end in claustrophobic, dirty realities. When we pull back and look at the multidimensional picture of April 1945, the truth of history's final mystery is not a thrilling tale of espionage and escape. It is a story of total systemic collapse. Economically, the Reich was bankrupt. Logistically, it was paralyzed. Tactically, it was outmaneuvered and outgunned by an enemy it fundamentally underestimated. And politically, it ended exactly as it began, in a state of violent, paranoid delusion. The classified Soviet files do not reveal a grand escape. They reveal the pathetic, gruesome mechanics of suicide in a concrete box, followed by a cynical, half-century-long intelligence game played by the Soviet state. The real tragedy is not that the truth was hidden, but that the truth was so ugly, so devoid of military honor, that millions found it easier to believe a Hollywood-style myth than to accept the brutal forensic reality of the bunker. War is not a movie. It does not offer dramatic final acts or secret getaway vehicles. It offers physics, ballistics, and the cold, unyielding math of attrition. The study of warfare teaches us that when logistics fail and command structures fracture, all the fanatical ideology in the world cannot stop an armored spearhead. The concrete walls of the bunker were not a fortress. They were a tomb built by a regime that refused to look at the map. Thank you for joining us in the War Room as we dissected the tactical and forensic reality of this historical flashpoint. Now I want to hear your strategic assessment in the comments below. What do you believe was the single biggest factor that guaranteed the destruction of the German war machine? Was it A, the catastrophic failure of German industrial and logistical capacity? Was it B, the overwhelming artillery and mechanized superiority of the Soviet Red Army? Or was it C, the absolute psychological delusion and micromanagement of the German High Command? Drop your answer in the comments and back up your tactical reasoning. Stay sharp, trust the math, and keep studying the battlefield.